Good afternoon, everyone, and today we have portfolio questions on education and lifelong learning. Question 1 from Jamie Hepburn has been withdrawn. A satisfactory explanation has been provided. Question 2, Graham Pearson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what action it is taking to increase the provision and uptake of Cantonese and Mandarin in schools.
Minister Alistair Allen.
The Scottish Government continues to encourage young people to learn Mandarin and Cantonese, as well as about Chinese culture and history. Over the last 5 years, we've launched 13 Confucius classrooms serving 17 local authorities across Scotland and have new national qualifications in Chinese languages at higher and advanced higher. In December, one of our Confucius classrooms at St Ninian's High School, East Renfrewshire, won the accolade of Best Confucius Classroom in the World at the World Confucius Institute Conference in Beijing.
Graham Pearson.
I thank the Minister for that response. He will understand how important it is that our young people in Scotland have a knowledge and understanding of the language, Cantonese and Mandarin. Can you give us some indication of how he will encourage the numbers of Scottish children uptaking these languages to advanced level? Minister.
Well, I recognise the members' involvement in this issue through the cross-party group in China, and I would certainly similarly be of the view that we should be working to increase the numbers. Indeed, we have managed to increase the numbers for presentations for Mandarin are up from 298 to 334 this year, and we've set ourselves targets for doubling the number of Mandarin teachers between 2011 and 2017, as well as in that period we have an aspiration to double the number of presentations too.
Thank you. Liz Smith.
Minister, you've just referred to the fact that good progress has been made in improving the situation with teaching and making sure that the GTC has got more qualified teachers in Mandarin and Cantonese. Having said that, in terms of local government employment of these teachers, there is a serious problem. Could you say what discussions you're having with the local governments in helping that?
Minister.
Well, my impression is that local authorities are very much engaged. As I've indicated, there are 17 local authorities are already working directly with the Confucius classrooms. But we obviously work through the 1+2 programme, for instance, as an ongoing programme of engagement with local authorities to make sure that we, both in government nationally and locally, are signed up to the idea that over the next few years we want all our children coming out of primary school with an exposure to 2 languages, one of which in many cases will be Cantonese or Mandarin.
Thank you. Christian Allard.
To ask the Scottish Government what plan it has to providing educational infrastructure in North East Scotland.
Sorry, my mistake. Question 3, Mike Mackenzie.
To ask the Scottish Government what steps it is taking to prevent the unnecessary or inappropriate closure of rural schools.
Cabinet Secretary Mike Russell.
Presiding Officer, I know the member, like myself, is deeply committed to our rural schools and recognises the importance they have to many communities. In order to improve and strengthen the process for all school closure proposals, the Scottish Government is taking forward amendments to the Schools Consultation Scotland Act 2010. For rural schools specifically, I intend to amend the Act to clarify how the presumption against closure should operate in practice. As many members on both sides of the Chamber will recall, a key policy objective of the 2010 Act, which was passed unanimously, was to create a presumption against closure for rural schools. However, following the recent judicial review, the Court concluded that the 2010 Act does not contain such a presumption, and the resultant confusion between communities and local authorities means there is a need to revise this. The Government's policy remains there should be a presumption against closure of rural schools. Consequently, our amendments will clarify exactly what is meant by this presumption and will describe it precisely in legal terms in order to ensure it will have the intended consequences.
Thank you. Mike Mackenzie.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. We now know that the population is increasing across many parts of rural Scotland. For example, in Shetland, we're already seeing very significant renewal of activity in the oil and gas sector. And the Scottish Islands Renewable Report, a joint UK and Scottish Government publication, suggests that renewable energy will create around 2,900 new jobs on Shetland.
And the question is?
By 2030. I'm getting there, Presiding Officer. In view of this, does the Cabinet Secretary believe that education authorities are taking a wide enough view in considering rural school closures?
Thanks. Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, there is a delicate balance to be had in this matter, and the member is right to draw attention to it. In areas where population is increasing, such as in Shetland, then there is a need to provide new schools or expand schools, and closing schools at the same time can be misunderstood and can be counterproductive. Building strong communities is an issue where population is expanding, but it's also an issue where population is declining. If I may mention Argyll and Bute, which I represent, there is a severely declining population, one of the worst population declines in Scotland. Closing rural schools there may accelerate population decline because it may threaten existing small communities. In all those circumstances, we need to be very careful when we're talking about closing good, viable rural schools. That is a very important thing. There is no evidence anywhere that the closure of a good school benefits education anywhere, and we should really remember that.
Many thanks. Question 4, Neil Findlay.
To ask the Scottish Government how many classroom assistants have been employed in schools in each of the last 5 years.
Minister Alistair Allen.
The number of classroom assistants employed in schools in each of the last 5 years are 5,505 in 2013, 5,666 in 2012, 5,623 in 2011, 5,430 in 2010 and 5,532 in 2009.
Thank you, Minister, for the answer. Classroom assistants play a very important role in schools and are often working with and building positive relationships with some of the most vulnerable pupils. What actions is the Minister taking to ensure that classroom assistants are employed in adequate numbers so that they continue to play the vital role that they do in our schools?
Minister.
Well, I certainly agree with the member about the vital role that classroom assistants do play in our school system. For instance, last year was a peak number in recent years for classroom assistants, and the numbers have been relatively stable throughout the last 5 years, as I've indicated. But certainly, obviously, at the end of the day, local authorities have to make decisions about how they employ classroom assistants and in what numbers. But the government makes clear our view of the importance and the central role that they have in the education system.
Many thanks. Question 5. Regrettably, John Pentland is unable to be with us at this time. Question 6. Roderick Campbell.
To ask the Scottish Government what steps it is taking to promote the teaching of Mandarin in schools.
Minister Alistair Allen.
The Scottish Government continues to encourage young people to learn Mandarin and Cantonese, as well as about Chinese culture and history. In addition to my answer provided in question 2 to Mr Pearson, I can add that we are also supporting 22 Chinese teachers from Tianjin schools to live in Scotland and work in their partner schools, and to provide annual funding for young people and head teachers from Scottish schools to visit China and to establish and foster links.
I thank the Minister for that answer. During visits to local schools, I'm aware of the advantage those schools have where they have a native speaker coming to take language classes in Mandarin. Does the Minister agree that foreign language assistants are vital to enhancing language learning in schools? And can you advise what action the Scottish Government is undertaking to increase the number of foreign language assistants in Scottish schools, particularly Mandarin?
Minister.
In terms of foreign language assistance overall, across all languages, we've managed to stabilise and slightly increase the numbers from, over the last 3 years, 59 to 70 to 73. And the Government works with various agencies, including the British Council and others, to make sure that number goes up. We certainly recognise that foreign language assistants can be a very cost-effective means of introducing native speakers to support the class teacher, and specifically around Chinese. One example would be the Early Learning of Chinese project, which was launched in 2013, involving over 30 Chinese-speaking students.
Question 7, Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what guidance it provides to ensure that children with additional support needs who are educated in mainstream schools receive appropriate support.
Minister Alistair Allen.
Through close collaboration with stakeholders, the Scottish Government has ensured a wide range of guidance documents on supporting those with additional support needs are accessible to practitioners, families, children and young people. For example, the Supporting Children's Learning Code of Practice provides guidance on the Act's provisions as well as on the supporting framework of secondary legislation.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank the Minister for his answer. Is the Minister convinced that all local authorities are applying GIRFEC to ensure the needs of children requiring additional support are met? And can exam course rules be made more flexible to take into account the needs of young people that may have communication difficulties?
Minister.
Well, the GIRFEC approach certainly puts each child at the very centre of service delivery, and provisions in the Children and Young People Scotland Bill with ongoing support from the National GIRFEC implementation team will, I believe, help to ensure consistency of implementation across Scotland. In addition, the Government places specific duties on local authorities under the Education Additional Support for Learning Act. The Scottish Qualifications Authority are careful to ensure that all assessment approaches are flexible and do not create barriers for learners who require additional support, and that would certainly include those learners with communication difficulties.
Ms Smith.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Could I ask a very similar question about those children who have additional support needs in residential care? What the Government is doing to provide that care, given that the criticism that was levelled by Audit Scotland just a few months ago in respect of the national framework, it didn't come out in a very good light.
Well, the same standards that would be applied in terms of the expectations that exist for inclusion and for educational standards would certainly apply there too. And the Government certainly has the needs of young people, whether they're in mainstream or residential or other forms of education, very much close to their hearts. In terms of mainstreaming versus residential and the wider issues around that, it's worth saying that while the Standards in Schools Act 2000 does provide a duty to mainstream as a norm, it certainly makes clear that where residential or other specialist education is more suitable for reasons of the proportionality of cost, or most importantly of all, the needs of the individual child, and that remains an option.
Many thanks. Question 8, John Mason.
To ask the Scottish Government what recent discussions it has had with independent theological colleges regarding tuition fees for students from Scotland.
Cabinet Secretary Mike Russell.
Presiding Officer, there have been no recent discussions. However, I have received a joint letter from the International Christian College in Glasgow and the Scottish Baptist College in Paisley regarding tuition fees for Scottish students. A response has been issued this week.
Many thanks. John Mason.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that reply. I wonder if he would agree that students are puzzled that Scottish students have to pay fees and cannot get a loan, whereas English students pay fees but can get a loan to cover that. I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary would be willing to meet myself and representatives from the colleges to see if we can find a way forward.
Cabinet Secretary.
I am, of course, willing to meet the member and representatives of the colleges. I should say, however, that whilst the member may be puzzled about it, there are, I believe, strong reasons why this exists. There are many advantages to study in Scotland, and I don't think those should be forgotten.
Many thanks. Question 9, Paul Martin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what steps it's taken to improve childcare provision in the Glasgow Province constituency.
Minister Aileen Campbell.
The Scottish Government is increasing and improving early learning and childcare provision for 3- and 4-year-olds and the most vulnerable 2-year-olds across Scotland from August 2014 through the Children and Young People Bill. 2-year-olds who are looked after or under a kinship care order are specified on the face of the bill. Any further expansion will be specified through secondary legislation. As the First Minister announced in the Chamber yesterday, we will also increase the number of 2-year-olds who will benefit from 600 hours of funded early learning and childcare from August this year. We will begin by focusing on those families most in need. From this August, the entitlement will cover 2-year-olds and families which are seeking work, approximately 15% of the total population of 2-year-olds. In August 2015, we will expand provision further to families claiming certain benefits under criteria currently used to determine eligibility for free school meals. That means from August next year, around 27% of 2-year-olds will receive funded provision. The bill will also introduce a requirement on all local authorities to consult with locally representative populations of parents on the patterns of early learning and childcare provisions which would best meet their needs. It will be the statutory duty of local authorities to implement the provisions within the bill on early learning and childcare.
Excellent. Paul Martin.
Presiding Officer, whilst the Minister's response may sound comprehensive, what is missing from the Minister's response is the issue of dealing with childcare for school-aged children. I wonder what provision the Government will bring forward, perhaps in their independent white paper or indeed in any future legislation. I know it's remiss from the Children and Young People's Bill in dealing with childcare provision specifically for school-aged children.
Minister.
And I absolutely agree that childcare for children who are beyond preschool years is very important. That's why I've asked the task force to look into this matter. But I guess it's no surprise that Paul Martin wants to dodge the issue that were announced yesterday, given that he voted against the extension that we proposed yesterday. Which is a real pity, and perhaps as well he would also want to explain to his Provan constituents about the fact that he voted against free school meals yesterday, which stands to benefit an additional 11,200 pupils in Glasgow, the city which he resides in.
Thanks. Claire Adamson.
Presiding Officer, does the Minister agree with me that transformational childcare can only be achieved with control over all areas of policy by ensuring that the tax raised in Scotland stays in Scotland?
Minister Aileen Campbell.
I absolutely agree with Claire Adamson's point. And the Labour Party may laugh, but I really don't think that talking about the future of our children is any laughing matter. And again, I go back to the fact that they voted against this progressive move that was mentioned yesterday. The proposals that we announced yesterday that I outlined into my response to Paul Martin and the proposals within the bill are a first step towards our wider work to enhance childcare. But the transformation we seek can only be achieved through independence. With independence, we will have the powers that give us access to the revenue generated by increased numbers of women in the labour market to pay for that increased provisions. Our ambitions for childcare cannot be funded on consequential handouts of our own money back from Westminster. This is about transforming the structure of our economy and the nature of our society. Plus, we will be able to divert the money wasted from the moral Trident weapons and divert it instead into the long-term well-being of our children. That's the kind of country, Presiding Officer, I want to stay in.
Presiding Officer, if the Labour Party voted against free school meals yesterday, then the SNP government voted against their own childcare policy by opposing the Labour amendment. I wonder whether the Minister would accept that yesterday's motion was actually about independence. It was titled Scotland's Future. Given that her motion said you needed independence to deliver on childcare, can she explain why she moved on childcare yesterday?
Minister.
I'm glad Kezia Dugdale's decided to take part in this little exchange, because I would also like to understand whether or not Kezia Dugdale's consulted any of the small businesses in the Lothian region that she represents, which she has suggested last night on the television would be what she would use to pay for 50% of the childcare. I'd also like to point out that we are focusing on families most in need, and we regret that the Labour Party decided to vote against it yesterday, and we would like to know from the Labour Party what they want to cut from the Scottish budget to fund their proposals, and also how they will deliver it in terms of the timescale that they're setting out, because those are the questions that they failed to discuss yesterday.
And returning to today's business, question 10, Drew Smith.
Presiding Officer, and on a more consensual note, can I ask the Scottish Government what discussions it has had with the European Union regarding objective justification for charging UK students tuition fees, but not students coming from other EU countries in the event of Scotland becoming independent?
Cabinet Secretary Mike Russell.
Mr Smith and I are known for consensual politics, of course. Ministers and officials have raised the issue of cross-border students in writing and in a series of meetings with the EU and other European states.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank the Cabinet Secretary very much for that answer. The Scottish Government has asserted that Scotland's border with England will be somehow unique in terms of European law, and that the ease of travel across it to study somehow means that the Scottish Government can blatantly break EU laws which are designed to prevent Member States discriminating against the citizens of another Member State, and presumably the Cabinet Secretary understands that's a position that will inevitably end up with us in court. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary what assessment he has made of the practice in other EU countries, such as our closest neighbour Ireland, which is part of the common travel area and has not attempted to impose a tuition fee only on English, Welsh and Northern Ireland students in the way that the Scottish Government are proposing, and what estimates has he made of the legal costs of defending that very dubious position?
Briefly, Cabinet Secretary.
Can I thank Mr Smith for the confirmation, I think the first time we've had it from the Labour Party, that Scotland will be an independent member of the EU. I'm grateful for that. I think that's a step forward. As set out on page 199 of Scotland's Future, which I'm sure he has read, the Scottish Government believes that continuing our current policy of charging fees to students from the rest of the UK to study at Scottish higher education institutions is the best way to maintain the positive current mix of students at Scottish universities and to ensure that students resident in Scotland can continue to access access higher education opportunities, something he would wish to happen. Each member state is, of course, presiding officer, free to adopt its own domestic policies consistent with the objectives of the EU. We believe that our fees policies contribute to student mobility across the wider EU while addressing the consequences of the unique situation of Scottish independence. In these circumstances, we believe it will be possible to deliver our policy in a way which is compatible with EU requirements.
Thank you. Mary Scanlon.
Thank you. I wondered, on an equally consensual note, if the Cabinet Secretary would explain to us the basis or the legal advice that he has used, which he deems will be acceptable in an independent Scotland, to discriminate against English, Welsh and Northern Ireland students compared to students from other EU countries. And can I ask if this advice will be made available to other MSPs?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I'm delighted to be consensual about this because there is legal advice that is in the public domain. It is the legal advice that exists for University of Scotland, which I'm sure she has read. And that legal advice is entirely clear. Now, all I can say about government legal advice is that ministers do not confirm or deny that legal advice exists. But of course, the First Minister has made it clear that everything in the White Paper is consistent with legal advice, and I would accept that if the First Minister says it is undoubtedly true in this instance as well. So in all those circumstances, I can simply assure her that this is well-founded, that the doctrine of objective justification is well understood across Europe, and there are a range of very special circumstances that apply which would make that defence of objective justification entirely legitimate in these circumstances. I'm sure that she also now recognises that Scotland, as an independent member of the EU, will have much to offer, and I'm quite sure that this will be part of its offering to make sure that we continue to be an achieving nation in higher education.
Joan McAlpine, briefly, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officers. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree with me that free higher education is helping to give Scottish students the best start to their careers by keeping student debt levels in Scotland lower than the rest of the UK?
I certainly have no difficulty in agreeing to that point. I think it is absolutely clear that right across these islands, it is Scottish students that have the great advantage in this, because debt levels have soared elsewhere. And they have soared elsewhere because of a policy that the UK government has pursued, a policy based upon a report commissioned by the Labour Party, which the Labour Party has continued to support, that these debt levels are absolutely soaring. Let me give you, Presiding Officer, the figures. Student loan company figures published in 2013 show that the average student loan debt for Scottish students is £6,850. In Wales, it is £14,910, and in England, it is £18,740. Those figures tell you the truth. Higher education in other parts of these islands is being monetarised. It will not be monetarised in Scotland.
Neil Baby, very briefly.
Mr Russell mentioned University Scotland legal advice in defence of his argument. Can he confirm that University Scotland legal advice says our UK students will require to be treated no differently from other EU students?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think you should read the totality of the advice. I mean, Mr Bibby, well, no. Mr Bibby, I pointed out yesterday, Mr Bibby's figures did not compute. His reading skills do not compute either. The totality of the legal advice indicates that there is a perfectly strong argument and case to be made on objective justification. If Mr Bibby was prepared to argue, for free education in Scotland, education based on the ability to learn, not the ability to pay, I would have more respect for his position. Absolutely. The fact that he is threatening Scottish students, present and future, with substantial amounts of debt rather invalidates any contribution he could make to the debate on higher education.
Many thanks. Question 11, Christina McKelvey.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government when the Cabinet Secretary for Education and Lifelong Learning last met local authorities and what education issues were discussed.
Cabinet Secretary Michael Russell.
Presiding Officer, I regularly meet with educational officials officers from local authorities across Scotland to discuss a wide range of education issues.
Christina McKelvey.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that short answer? Can I draw to the attention of the Cabinet Secretary the continuous issues about poor support and organisation for children requiring autism primary education from South Lanarkshire Council? In particular, the issue of South Lanarkshire Council eventually granting a placing request only to be told, to parents to be told, that they will not provide transport. I may add, Presiding Officer, that the actual delivery of the primary education is very good. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary to meet with me and some of the parents I know who have raised these issues with me in relation to the autism education services and support from South Lanarkshire Council?
Cabinet Secretary.
Of course, I'm more than willing to meet with the member and her constituents to discuss this issue. I think we should always be willing to listen to parents' views on educational matter, but of course the provision of education is a statutory responsibility for the appropriate local authority, in this case South Lanarkshire. In discharging their duties, legal duties, authorities are responsible for the setting of school admissions policies, which includes the procedures for dealing with placing requests. They have a duty to make arrangements, such arrangements as they consider necessary, but for transport between home and schools of pupil residing and attending schools in their areas. If a pupil, however, is attending the school on a placing request, the local authority does not have to provide a school bus or any help with transport costs. However, I would make two caveats. One, if there are spare seats on buses, an authority can offer those pupils not entitled to transport free or at a cost. These places are often referred to privileged places. And the second point I would make is where there is a case of support needs, I would expect a local authority to be very sympathetic and supportive indeed. One of the issues that every member in this chamber knows is that parents of children with support needs often have to fight extra hard to get the type of support and services that they are entitled to. And I think local authorities have an obligation to make sure that those parents do not have to do that.
Many thanks. Question 12, Alison McInnes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what action it is taking to ensure that children in hospitals out with their home local authority area are provided with education.
Minister Alistair Allen.
The responsibility for the provision of education for children and young people who are unable to attend school due to ill health rests with education authorities. To support authorities in delivering this duty, the Scottish Government has published guidance in 2001 to education authorities. This guidance is in the process of being revised to ensure that it takes account of the current policy and legislative landscape and is firmly focused on the collaborative working required to meet the needs of each individual child and young person.
Alison McInnes.
I thank the Minister for his response. Recent research by Action for Sick Children Scotland found that just over a quarter of wards surveyed reported they don't provide education for children from other local authority areas. It claims that this is in part due to cumbersome arrangements between local authorities. This is clearly contrary to government guidance. And while I welcome the actions that he has outlined, what barriers has he identified that still need to be overcome? And will the Minister prioritise work with local authorities and NHS boards to resolve this matter and ensure that every child is provided, within the constraints of their medical condition, with education no longer than 5 days after their admission?
Minister.
Well, obviously, this is an issue of key importance, and as I've indicated, the Government is working to ensure that the guidance is adequate to cope with some of these situations. The refresh process that I mentioned is something that has actually involved the Action for Sick Kids, National Parents Forum and others to ensure that we address issues. In terms of she asked what issues they are, there are a number of issues that have been raised, but amongst them are the cooperation, levels of cooperation between different education authorities. The varying costs is another of provision, and I'm sure that the group that's working on this will find a way forward which will ensure that the rules are updated.
Many thanks. Question 13, Dennis Robertson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what the next steps are following the moratorium on rural school closures.
Cabinet Secretary Mike Russell.
Presiding Officer, following the moratorium and the report of the Commission on the delivery of rural education, I am taking forward, as I've said, amendments to the legislation on school closures. I expect these amendments to improve the consultation process for all school closure proposals and clarify the presumption against closure for rural schools specifically. Parents and communities deserve a consultation process which is open and honest, and for decision-making to be transparent. They also deserve to have a real say in decisions that affect them. I expect our amendments, along with improvements to statutory guidance for the 2010 Act, to deliver this.
Dennis Robertson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thank you, Cabinet Secretary, for that answer. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree with me that closure should not just be based on the role alone? Given that the Cabinet Secretary had to intervene in Logie Coldstone in my constituency, where the roll number was 8 in 2010-11, the now number is 25 for 2013-14. If that school had closed, it would have been devastating for the community. If it wasn't for the intervention of the Cabinet Secretary and the parents' group, it would have been devastating for that community. Can the Cabinet Secretary just reassure me and other parents in rural areas that schools should not close based on role alone?
Cabinet Secretary.
The member raises a very important issue, and I entirely agree with him. Numbers are only one of the criteria that any authority would want to be aware of, and indeed numbers can change quite dramatically. The example you give of, the member gives of Logie Coldstone is replicated across the country. I know of many schools threatened with closure, which were down into single figures, which are now literally bursting at the seams. So educational benefit is at the centre of the school closure process. That's what we've built into the Act. That's what we're emphasising and stressing as we go forward. Scotland's geography dictates that we're always going to need to have small rural schools. Scotland's flourishing rural sector can only flourish if we continue to have services provided within rural localities. Local authorities are supported to provide rural schools through the GAE funding mechanism. Local authorities should, indeed must, explore all reasonable alternatives to the closure of a rural school and listen to suggestions from the community about alternative solutions. And I think the amendments we're bringing forward to the 2010 Act will help to do that.
Many thanks. Question 14, Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government how its education policy supports children with additional special needs.
Mr Alistair Allen.
The Education Additional Support for Learning Scotland Act 2004 was put in place to support our commitment that all children and young people with additional support needs receive the education and support they require to achieve their maximum potential in life. The Act places strict duties on local authorities to meet the additional support needs for all children for whose school education they are responsible and to tailor provision according to their individual needs. The Supporting Children's Learning Code of Practice explains these duties, providing guidance on the Act's provisions as well as on the supporting framework of legislation.
Beamish.
I thank the Minister for that answer. But considering the fact that there has, I understand, been an 89% increase in children with additional support needs, could the Minister explain how the Scottish Government intends to address this issue, particularly when fewer teachers are fulfilling the ASN statutory requirements, and the umbrella group, Scotland's Children's Services Coalition, fears, and I quote, that teachers and other education staff do not have the time and resources to give all ASN children the help they need. Indeed, from my own experience working with children on the autism and dyslexia spectrums and in discussion with others, I would agree with this. So what can the Minister do to address these concerns in relation to initial and ongoing teacher training and also support staff training?
While I certainly don't underestimate the work that is involved and the commitment that is involved for teachers dealing with children with additional needs, I certainly do not recognise that the comment that was made there that somehow teachers are not fulfilling their statutory duties in this respect. In terms of the increase, and there has been an increase in the number of children recorded with additional needs, while the Government is working to make provision for this, it should be said as well that a large proportion of that increase is, of course, because the definition of additional needs now captures many more needs than it previously did.
Many thanks. Question 15, Nanette Milne.
Thank you. Could I ask the Scottish Government what steps it is taking to ensure that schools provide opportunities to learn the skills that will be required in the oil and gas and renewables sector?
Minister Angela Constance.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Learning and skills development, which supports pathways into the energy sector, is embedded within Curriculum for Excellence and features in a number of qualifications. The Sciences and Technologies curriculum areas provide opportunities for learners to explore different types of energy sources and their uses. Education Scotland has also developed resources to support teaching on energy and to build young people's awareness of careers in the sector, such as the STEM Central website, which uses engineering as a context for learning. Energy Skills Scotland are also working with industry to facilitate better engagement with schools.
Thank you. Nanette Milne.
I thank the Minister for her helpful response. Aberdeenshire and Angus councils are already taking very positive steps to promote oil and gas career opportunities to pupils. I do believe, however, that more needs to be done to promote future opportunities in the oil and gas sector to young people right across Scotland, and this should be given more significance in career advice within Scottish schools. I agree that some steps are being taken, but what discussions are ministers having with the oil and gas and renewables industry to help not only meet future workforce needs and skills, but also to overcome the current very significant shortage of such skills?
Minister.
Thank Mrs Milne for her supplementary question, and I do appreciate her interest in this matter as one of the co-conveners of the Oil and Gas Cross-Party Working Group, and I've certainly seen over Christmas her comments on this very matter in Energy Voice. Can I say, in terms of energy, oil and gas in particular, it's a huge bonus for the Scottish economy, and there is a result of that, a wealth of opportunities for young people, young women, as well as young men, and we have to ensure that those opportunities are available to young people the length and breadth of Scotland. And I know the good work that happens in Aberdeen, Aberdeenshire and Angus Council's areas, and the onus is upon us all to see how we can extend and learn from that very good practice, because certainly this government wants to see deeper and more comprehensive engagement between the world of education and the world of work. And in terms of our ongoing work, there's obviously the Wood Commission, which Mrs Milne and her colleagues, I'm sure, are aware of. Energy Skills Scotland here is crucial in terms of developing a long-term coordinated plan for the whole country. Wood, who I've already mentioned, has made some very pertinent recommendations in relation to STEM and to careers advice. So there is a wealth of work already ongoing, but we do need to ensure, and I hope I can reassure Mrs Milne, that the opportunities that exist for young people in the North East have to be available to young people the length and breadth of Scotland.
Excellent. Question 16, Liam MacArthur.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what evidence it has that team teaching brings the same benefits to children as smaller class sizes.
Cabinet Secretary Mike Russell.
Presiding Officer, the Education Lower Primary Class Sizes Scotland Regulations 1999 and the Education Lower Primary Class Sizes Scotland Amendment Regulations 2010, which prescribe maximum class size limits for P1, 2 and 3 classes, provide that where teaching is conducted by more than one teacher, the class size limit can be exceeded. This provision was actually introduced primarily to overcome accommodation constraints and is not specifically linked to the achievement of the wider benefits of smaller class sizes. But clearly there is contact time with each child is increased by the use of 2 teachers, and that will have some effect.
Okay, Liam MacArthur.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that response, and I would certainly acknowledge the benefits which team teaching can deliver and the dedication of the teachers working in such a way. But my concern is that team teaching is a necessity for some schools, as the Education Secretary suggested, because of a lack of space, rather than a choice based on educational outcomes. Now, given the figures suggesting that between 2010 and 2012 there was a 20% increase in the number of team-taught classes in P1 and P3, does he think there is a case for looking again with local authorities, education trade unions and others at whether or not there's more that can be done to reduce that requirement to provide team-taught classes?
Cabinet Secretary.
The member raises an important issue, and I think that we should look closely at the issues of team teaching. I think the involvement of team teaching in any situation may be beneficial to children. There has been an increase in team teaching, and that may well be, looking at the figures that the member has, that may well be particularly in areas where there has been an increase in population, where there is pressure on the school buildings. I think the member is right to draw attention to that. I'm very happy to discuss this further with the member. I also think, as we look at our taking forward the class size issue, that looking at this issue in that context will be useful, and I will undertake to do so.
Thank you. Question 17, Christian Allard.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what plans it has for providing educational infrastructure in North East Scotland.
Secretary Mike Russell.
The Scottish Government is investing more than £134 million in 8 new secondary schools and 1 new primary school in North East Scotland through the £1.25 billion Scotland Schools for the Future programme between now and March 2018. In addition, in academic year 2013-14, the Scottish Funding Council provided around £5 million of capital funding to colleges and universities in North East Scotland for ongoing maintenance of the educational infrastructure.
Thanks. Christian Allard.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his answer. Will you join me in welcoming the £19.9 million that has been provided by the Scottish Government through the Scottish Futures Trust for the new Harford Community Campus in Aberdeenshire?
I'm delighted to do so, though perhaps we're being thanked for a slight over-generosity. The total value of the project is about 19.9. The contribution from the Scottish Futures Trust is 13.3 million, or 2/3 of the total. But it is great news for the North East. It's another demonstration of the Government's commitment to the delivery of a high-quality school estate across all of Scotland. I'm sure Mr Allard will be generous in welcoming the fact that, in addition to AFERD, the Government is supporting the replacement of 2 further secondary schools in Aberdeenshire, Ellen and Mearns Academies, through the Schools for the Future programme. Completion of these 3 projects is a total investment of around £78 million, with Scottish Government contributions of over £14 million, benefiting around 2,000 pupils.
Thank you. And that concludes portfolio questions. And we'll now move to the next item of business, which the presiding officer will announce and take.